Good afternoon, everyone. It's Dr. Gershon with another Endeavor Better Health webinar. I am thrilled to be here today with an incredible data scientist, Zoran Krunic, and he is going to talk about the future of AI, machine learning, and quantum computing in biotechnology, both from a perspective of what is important here and now and what is important over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of bringing new technology to biotechnology firms so that we can improve drug discovery, drug development, and most importantly, patient outcomes. I am thrilled to say that 2023 was a fantastic year for the Endeavor Better Health webinar series, in large part because of the great speakers like Zoran, but really because of the support that everyone in the audience has given us. I want to strongly urge everyone when they log on to please put your comments in the comment section and your email and where you're dialing in from, and we'd be more than happy to respond to any questions that you have by emailing you back. Today is a fantastic opportunity to really get insights from a leading scientist at one of the top biotech companies in the world, Amgen. The company is responsible for a remarkable pipeline of drugs that are impacting patients and making patients' lives better. Going forward, the key for biotechnology and many biopharma companies in general is what is the business strategy that will allow the incorporation of AI, machine learning, and other innovations to be able to integrate these technologies to produce more novel drugs, faster, less expensive, with a more precision and personalized medicine approach. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce a terrific scientist. Zoran, thank you so much for coming today. It's a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
I welcome you, to the Endeavor Better Health platform to talk about things that you've been working on now for decades. And I know that you work in the R&D department at Amgen, looking specifically at these new technologies of AI and machine learning, work with the AWS and Amazon platform and the people in AWS. And so you have this incredible breadth of exposure to really important channels of new drug discovery, new drug development, and most importantly, a real world practical understanding about how to integrate innovation, technology, and scientific discoveries into a business ecosystem. So this intersection between science, technology, and business is really what we're here to talk about. What does leadership need to know in the new emerging companies and their CEO, founder, entrepreneur teams? How do they bring that technology to Amgen? And what does Amgen have in its crystal ball over the next 5 to 10 years to use this technology to improve healthcare? So first, if you could start off by telling us very, I think, briefly about your background, and then we'll move into these broader, really important questions to discuss today.
So thank you, Martin, for inviting me to speak here. I joined Amgen about 5.5 years ago with the primary role was to work on natural language processing, machine learning models related to clinical trials, electronic health records. And that's extremely important if you look at the pharmaceutical process. You have molecules discovery and then you have clinical trials. And so that was really a big kind of task. Prior to that, I was with Optum, part of United Health Group, for about 18 years. Background is I have master's in computer science, and so work in data science and machine learning for a number of years, so lots of big data, so pretty much all the components that we are using actively today. So that's my background. Now, as far as the new technology, so the world had changed a lot in the last year and a half when it comes to new technologies. I think what we When I joined Amgen, the natural language processing was really the focus in context of machine learning, but combined together. And we made progress. We had some of the pretty good models that were analyzed in the context of the sentences and how that works in big documents and how you extract that information, put in machine learning models. But then, as we know, a year plus ago, everything changed when ChatGPT came out, and you suddenly have something that an entity you can have a conversation with. And so that world will never be the same again. And I think that type of a change is that inflection point that we saw there is something that may become more of a I don't want to say common thing, but we're going to have to become used to deal with big changes and big advances in technology and figure out how to incorporate them into the business processes. And that's not easy, of course. Up until recently, for example, usually when you work, you have a Chrome browser and you do Google search if you need some information. Now the screen is split in two parts, right? There is a ChatGPT conversation or Anthropic, which is my favorite model as well. And you have a browser there. And so it changed the way I do my work, but I think it changes the way lots of departments or organizations are going to do their work as well. And it is the type of a change that I think we may not have expected quite. But I think, for example, I see Amgen is extremely well positioned and doing an excellent job in evaluating these new technologies going in. We had a number of public announcements last year, press releases, a collaboration with NVIDIA for molecular discovery, with Amazon AWS and their Bedrock platform for generative AI and LLMs. So research is happening and we are merging and looking. And I think this is something that, again, everybody does at your personal level as well as an organizational level, is to combine what you do and try to integrate these processes together. Now, obviously, as the complexity of the large organization kicks in, that gets a little more complicated and more challenging. But if there is a common denominator, I think there are probably two of those. One is everything is becoming far more interdisciplinary, right? That's something that, while we knew about that before, since Google's AlphaFold a couple of years ago, now molecular discovery is routinely done with machine learning, large language models as part of that, right? And so that's quite a bit of a change. The second one is that the need to spend multiple sciences and bring them together in what probably you can call applied science is becoming really important. And so requires multitude of skills, requires scientists to understand the context in which the data is created, because more or less everything is based on the data. And on the other side, the business needs to start to acquire the knowledge about new technologies very fast. And usually that leads to collaborations because you can't do everything on your own. So there's a lot going on. And I think that mapping of that space, 6 months, year, 3, 5, 10 years out, I think it's quite complex, but that's where we are today. So.
That's fantastic. You touch on so many points. The key point there really is, the complexity of the problems now in healthcare does require collaboration. It requires a multidisciplinary approach. The ability to bring in real subject matter experts like yourself into, a drug discovery, drug development platform requires this understanding about how to navigate and integrate, really outstanding new innovations into a very, very large enterprise level business. And, you and I have talked previously about the importance of the understanding that's required and the skill sets that are needed in CEO, entrepreneur, founders in these emerging companies, which are hyper growth, super exciting, cutting edge. Their ability to understand what does it take to actually integrate. Who do you speak to in terms of opening doors in a company like Amgen? What does the roadmap look like? And then most importantly, what are the concerns that a large enterprise biotech, biopharma company has in bringing innovation in-house? And one of the things that we talked about really was, the notion of building out teams that can execute and projects that, a company like Amgen, can work on with some of these companies. And so perhaps we could talk a little bit about some of the things that you personally are working on, your R&D team are working on, as an example or some case studies about important projects that I think speak to the future of where Amgen is looking to go.
So yeah, there are lots of interesting questions that you mentioned. So for example, when you look at the building of teams, which is very critical, and you look at the problem, usually those are teams that are formed across the organization. And you need expertise from technology, from business, subject matter experts who understand clinical environment, for example, clinical trials, molecular discovery. And then you have technology teams and PMs and so forth. So that need to build multidisciplinary teams, I think it's bigger than ever. And usually that's how we operate. So you cross department lines, if you like, and those are basically Amgen-wide projects and wide teams. And I think if the startup or collaboration that happens with external entity comes in, I think that's the part where you have the first critical step, which is, can that, let's say it's an AI startup or it's a quantum computing startup, can they understand the clinical environment? And I think that's the first very important step. I'll give you a very simple example. For example, lots of data that we deal with today comes from, it's called the real world data, real world evidence, right? Electronic health records is a very interesting example. FDA, we are in a highly regulated environment. FDA had issued recommendations on data imputations, for example, because electronic health records do have missing data, and it's normal. It's not something that, it simply means that some patients have more data, some patients have less data. Healthier patients generally have less data. And so when you look at imputing data to build the models that require some data to be in every point, you need to understand the clinical context in which the data is created. And that means that now if you are, there was an interesting research paper, for example, last year published on imputation using quantum computing. And so now if you take that problem and say, okay, we have a solution that looks promising. Now, how do we apply it in clinical setting with patient data? That means now you have to bring subject matter experts who understand the clinical context so you can figure out, for example, how to impute the data, because you cannot just average the data and put it in the missing points, because that means that healthier patient will get average from the unhealthy patient, so that's, or less healthy patient, so that's not how you can do it. So there is a lot of that going on, and I think subject matter experts who span these two, technology and application area, are going to be critical, because that glue is where you figure out how to build your use cases, how to perhaps prioritize different use cases, because there are lots of use cases and many of them are high value, but how you prioritize, I think it will depend on how you look at this together. And so I think that's the part that is going to be more and more important. The other one, I think, is that you cannot wait for these technologies too long. If it becomes safe to implement, that probably means that you're late already, right? So you are going to have to go somewhat early and provide a balanced investment of time and resources into different technologies. And that means that you have to be willing to fail sometimes. If there is no failure, you're not going to be able to learn anything from it. And so I think that's probably a slightly different mindset that's going to be important, that experimentation with different use cases has to mean that out of 10 use cases, maybe 3 will really work well and the other 7 may not. It's not that different than when venture capital invests in startup companies, right? You get one star that makes all the advancement and all the profit, and the rest may be a wash. So I think with use cases, we may see somewhat similar pattern, but I think that's really a critical part, that merging of technologies and a regulated context. I think it's something that startup companies and external vendors kind of need to be able to bridge. And of course, you work with internal parts, our experts as well. But I think that's something that's going to be very, very common.
Let me ask you this in terms of some of the drug discovery, drug development work. There are different channels in which AI can function, and the use cases for AI and machine learning. Talk a little bit about how you see AI machine learning in terms of being a tool that augments our ability to look at drug discovery and create completely novel new targets. That is one area that I think is part of the overall equation. The other, I think, component is perhaps the ability for AI to create more personalized medicine, more effective drugs. So that's a second piece. And then the third piece is the time to market, the ability to create stronger drug development programs so that clinical trials are more effective, patient trial fit is more effective, the time to market and the cost of drug development is reduced. So pick any of those three areas, they're all equally important.
Yeah, and they're actually connected. It's a very good combination and sequence of them. So when you go into molecular development right now, although that's not my background truly, but I think what you see is that large language models are becoming hugely important in that area, and they generate list of molecules, so molecules that are the candidates to then go into preclinical testing, in silico testing, and then go further into phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials. The ability to see through those trials and ask the question, can I design the molecule that I know will be going through all 3 phases of clinical trials and become a medication? It's still hard, and it's still something that everybody's trying to understand. But I think the ability to generate molecules faster will shrink that time, and then the ability to execute clinical trials through, for example, being able to structure the information that's needed to build clinical trials better. We have a lot of unstructured text, unstructured information documents that we can now extract information from using generative AI, like Anthropic, like OpenAI, GPT models through their API interfaces. And those become new features in machine learning models. And so we have the ability, or we are starting to see that, to build better models, which helps you in selecting patient cohorts and everything else, again, keeping in mind that this is a strongly regulated environment. So I think, and then of course there is always a need to make the clinical trials shorter, more effective, and lots of things that happen with personalized medicine. I think it's going to be very important. For example, our ability to generate better models with the data that we can acquire about patients is going to be extremely critical. I think for example, if you look at the quantum computing, there is a strong hypothesis that the models in quantum computing could be trained on smaller data sets and provide equivalent accuracy. And so that's really important. There are lots of clinical trials. Amgen just acquired a company in large acquisition for rare diseases. And so you're going to have small data sets in general. Lots of oncology comes with small data sets when you have 100, 200 patients. And so building machine learning models in those cases is difficult. Quantum computing has the hypothesis right now, and there is lots of work happening there. That's one of the things I've been working on, to see how much accuracy we can get out of training the models, which are trained only on 100, 150 samples. Can we do that so that then the prediction outside the data set is better? And so those are areas where it's going to be very important, because even with personalized medicine, you're going to look at relatively small amount of data. And so collecting the genomics data is never easy. There is lots of regulation around that as well. And so I think that's the part where we're going to have to figure out how all that comes together. But certainly, I think the tools that we have right now are considerably better than, let's say, 3 to 5 years ago.
No, that's fantastic. One of the things that we talked about, in this conversation and an earlier conversation is, the need that large biotech companies like Amgen have for new, exciting companies to come to them. And, one of the asks, I think, from industry at large for entrepreneur founders is to be resilient and to adapt. That is to say that, things change very, very quickly. The needs of enterprise change quickly. And I would like you to speak a little bit about this issue of resilience and the ability to adapt, so that there can be a clear message for young CEO entrepreneur founders of what Amgen is looking for in terms of young companies, and what kind of skill sets do some of these entrepreneur founders need to understand, they need to bring to the table when speaking to you, when speaking to other leaders, to bring their technology into core business use cases?
Yeah, so I'll speak from what my experience is, and when I talk with startups and possible use cases that we can use, I think there are a couple of elements there. One is that, again, it's the context in which the data and models will be applied. I think that's really important to understand, and so that knowledge needs to be somehow built into that process. The other one, I think, is internally from the department or corporation perspective. I think there is a need to understand these new technologies very quickly. And I think generative AI is one of the areas where you can actually have a very effective training built using generative AI. So you're kind of using it to build something that then the rest of the team can use to acquire the knowledge and needed to manage the processes better. I think from the startup environments, I think from the startup company's perspective, they will need to be able to understand the use cases that exist in these environments much better. I think the time that you have to execute use cases is probably not a problem. I think you can certainly, and everybody understands that for example, quantum computing is a long-term play. With generative AI, it's a little bit different. I think we are in a position to get some results right away, but it's a lot more complex because there are many different levels of how you use generative AI. So I think the other thing is that with generative AI, there is a data privacy. So when we feed data into the models, we need to make sure that the data points don't go and be used, don't end up being used in model training. So Amazon Bedrock, for example, is the platform that has that statement that says your data is going to stay here. But I think any model is going to have to fit into that constraint very well for any medical data to go into the model. So I think that's really, and companies like OpenAI, for example, they have that guarantee through Microsoft Azure Cloud. I think Anthropic has that through Bedrock. So it's being worked on, but I think it's going to have to be really absolutely clear that whatever data you put in has to be protected, basically, that it doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's the part that there is still some, I think, hesitation and some questions, but I have no doubt that that's going to be resolved probably very quickly. And I think once you have that, you will have the ability to get a lot better information understanding from lots of unstructured text that we haven't really used much in the past because it's just very difficult to extract the information. The other area is going to be, can you use generative AI for example, programming? We all use OpenAI, and I use Anthropic as well to write some smaller functions and code when I need it to help with that. You still have to check it. It's up to us, of course. But that's also an interesting point. For example, if you are going to come into an environment like this, you can run your use cases and look at the results, but eventually you're going to have to decide, how do I put this in production, right? How do I put this in use? And the question is, how much can we trust these models? So I can have subject matter expert look at the documents, and some of those are very complex, and say, okay, this answer looks, for example, research paper, did it summarize it very well? Does it have the code that I can use to run the research that's in the paper? But when it comes to more complex questions, you can read the paper, you can read the results, and it looks okay, but you cannot be quite sure, right? I tested that on the paper we published a year plus ago, and so that helped me because I knew that the content inside out. But when you don't know, the question is always, how do I know how accurate the answer is? Can I really trust it? And how do I put it in lights out environment where now everything is running into automated pipeline? Will that work, and how do I handle that? I don't think we have a very good answer to that today. We cannot just have subject matter experts label documents for every possible complex question that happens. It's not practical. So we're going to have to figure out something. Maybe it's generative adversarial networks. Maybe it's some kind of other model playing against each other. But we need to figure out the way to more or less automate the verification of the output of those models to be able to trust them, especially when it comes to more complex questions. So I think that's probably one of the immediate challenges. We, for example, I spend a lot of time working on prompt engineering, which is how do you ask a question? And there are some very interesting, that's probably subject to separate conversation, but there are some very interesting angles that you can see there, that changes in the prompt that don't seem to be very big, cause very big difference in the answer. And so the question is, how do you play that, right? And how do you navigate the environment? So there's a lot going on, and I think over the next probably year or two, we are going to be hopefully making some progress in structuring that so that you can put processes in production that actually use AI without having to worry. I think we are going to need human in the loop for quite some time, probably, to make sure that everything is okay. I think other things that come to mind are things like log analytics. You log all the information that's happening with AI, and then you run a separate process. And I think log analytics itself may be a big area using AI. That's something that we haven't had. So I think there is quite a bit of a playground there to explore different possibilities for companies and startups as well.
No, that's fantastic. That's really kind of in-depth inside information. These are really cues for entrepreneurs to understand what's important at a large biotech company like Amgen. One of the areas which may not necessarily be directly in your wheelhouse, but certainly is important in the overall process of drug development, is logistics. And AI and machine learning certainly appear to be a very interesting tool to improve logistics. Some of those logistical issues play into the effectiveness of clinical trials. Some of them play into some of the, really detailed components of clinical trials, like the transportation of temperature-sensitive drugs. Some of them play into the ability to decentralize clinical trials. I know some of these are not directly, in your target zone, but do you have any thoughts about this element of AI machine learning and the logistics component of what a biotech company would be interested in?
So I think from the general standpoint, machine learning and empowered by the features that come from AI and the ability to perhaps even oversee some of the processes, like what human could do in some cases, I think that's certainly relevant. One part that I think is been there for a long time, and it will continue to be present, is optimizations. All these processes have optimizations underneath that. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure how generative AI will fit into this, but I know that quantum computing will. There are lots of promises that quantum computing, and there is lots of work being done, can do optimizations better and faster than classical computing. And I think that's the part, because optimizations really, if you think about it, underpins lots of different things in machine learning, in optimization of transportation, I mean, you name it. And so I think with quantum computing, we are still waiting for that inflection point that we saw with ChatGPT, NLP, for example, a couple of years ago. I think my guess is that quantum computing is probably where NLP and generative AI were maybe 3 years ago, 5, depending on that. But I think once we see that inflection point, many companies are working on the increased number of qubits, which once you cross that inflection point, you will be able to run optimizations that you just couldn't simulate classically. And so once you have that, I think you should get the ability to run these optimizations even in real time, and in a way that just brings you overall better improvements in processes. And even sometimes, even if it's only a couple of % improvement on the large scale, that's a huge factor. And so that will be very significant. But I think quantum computing may be probably the biggest player in that area.
Yeah, that's such a great insight into, crystal balling, where drug discovery, drug development is going. And certainly that leads, to the question, if you had to look 5 to 10 years out, do you see the integration of AI, machine learning, and quantum as really being kind of a core functionality of biotech companies? There is some question right now as to the speed in which this innovation and technology is going to be used at the core of drug discovery, drug development, R&D.
So I think once we start productionizing things, different processes with quantum and AI, I think we are going to see how stable and how sustainable those are. I think that's going to be a really important parameter. Running use cases in laboratory setting is one thing, but putting things in production, I spent lots of years working in those environments a while back, is a different story. So I think we're going to have to see more robustness, both from quantum computing and from generative AI. I think from generative AI, especially the question of, is it hallucinating or is it giving us the correct answer, and how that gets solved is going to be critical. So I think the more time goes, though, we will see that those processes will get to the core of the functions. I think just like LLMs are now becoming the key component in molecular discovery, something that 5 years ago we just didn't see, probably, and the majority of people at least didn't. And I think from that perspective, how far it goes, I think it's, to a large extent, it will also depend on employees, on organizations, how much they adopt those processes and how much they're willing to embrace them. I think if you are a very successful organization, the business processes drive the speed and the data creation and everything downstream. But I think the new technologies need to be incorporated, and sometimes they require changes in processes. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially when you're successful. I think that actually becomes a little bit more challenging. So I think there's going to be some adjustment there as to how we bring that, you can call it really disruption in some way, into the processes, and yet continue to function in a way that's smooth and that's expected. But I think a lot of that will be on people who work in this area to learn, to be open to realize that every 3 to 5 years you're going to have to relearn half of the things that you're working on, and not rely just on there are some old sciences and knowledge that we use that are kind of true and proven, right? But the new ways of doing things are going to be critical, and so we have to kind of mix those two together in a sensible way. I think that's, and learn. I think a lot of new learning is coming, and I think that's really important.
That last paragraph and that part of your discussion is so important. There is the human part of this equation. I look at AI, machine learning, and all these new technologies as an opportunity to free up our time to devote to the more human side of what we bring to the problem solution set. And what you just spoke to really, frankly, underscores that issue, which is, for those who are passionate and dedicated to improving the healthcare system, it's a constant challenge to really address your knowledge as a human being and being able to improve that knowledge base by continuing to observe, be resilient, adapt, pivot, learn more, and really ask the questions which we've been asking today. What is it that industry needs to be able to drive progress to improve patient care? What does it need to drive progress in terms of new skill sets which generate new creative ideas? As technology improves, we can't just be dormant. We can't just sit and say, you know what, as we improve AI, machine learning, and quantum, problems are going to be solved. I think what you pointed out, we are still the captain of the ship.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can outsource lots of manual tasks and free up the time for creativity. I think that's going to be the key. I don't think this is a zero-sum game. I think these new tools are opening up territories that were simply not there before. And so I think that's an opportunity to look at this in not just half full, but much more than half full instead of half empty, and actually say, yeah, there is a lot more that we can do now that we couldn't do before. And so I think that's a territory that everybody can go in and be creative and outsource simple tasks to generative AI and get performance improvements from quantum computing as it happens. So I'm very optimistic about all of that.
As am I. And Zoran, I can't thank you enough for these really important points. It's a combination of years of experience as a scientist, years of experience as an R&D business person, and being a very practical person about what works, what moves the needle, what moves progress. I can't wait for our next webinar discussion for updates over the course of 2024 to see how Amgen and you and your team are using some of these technologies. Looking forward, I see nothing but blue skies for patients, which is really what it's all about. More novel drugs, faster to market, less expensive, more precise and personalized medicine, the ability to perform clinical trials at a higher level with greater integration of patient trial fit, more understanding of the diversity that's necessary within the patient populations for clinical trials. And really, as you said, the automation of this process allows us to be more and more creative and more effective in terms of using human and financial resources. So I can't thank you enough for sparking this conversation. And I hope that people continue to chime in and be active participants in this platform, which at Endeavor we believe is an open source call for collaboration, partnership, and sharing of ideas. So Zoran, thank you so much for all of your insightful comments.
Oh, thank you, Martin, for inviting me here. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you again. Stay tuned. I just want to sign off here, but don't